pre-workout preaching session. Once again, I'm back at it, my friends. So the topic of discussion today is, does existence and the sense of being require some point of experience for us to actually accumulate enough experience for us to be classified as a being of existence itself? Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's say that your existence is literally extremely mundane. So mundane, in fact, that due to the fact that your experience in life is something which is so subpar that it literally does not spark as much of a stimulus upon your being, to the point in which you yourself in this experience don't even necessarily have experience and are unaware of your own experience, and in essence therefore being an unconscious being. So does experience itself actually give us our sense of being and of consciousness, where literally our existence is an inevitability given the extent of the universe and its infinite vastness? We've gone so far forward that we're back to where it was that we will be again, pretty much. So that being said, what if your existence and in this eternal and infinite loop is something which is very, I guess, poor? But if your existence is so extremely bad, then what this line of thinking actually goes to say is that if your existence is so bad, meaning that you don't even have the experience to exist itself, then literally you're something which doesn't necessarily fall under the classification of existing and existence and of being. So even though we're kind of trapped in like this infinite loop of existing, because if we ourselves didn't experience everything that we experienced, then we wouldn't be who we are today, because that's what makes us up, makes us who we are. You'd be unaware of your own being. For something to truly be classified as intelligence in our own terms, it itself, by default, would eventually develop things naturally, forms of emotion, and it would develop a sense of understanding the illogical and irrational behaviors which we ourselves all do for the sake of humors. Because something which is purely logical would dive into the depths of existence itself, and in doing so, it would discover the rational behavior behind a lot of irrational action, based purely upon the fact that the humors themselves are a logical thing if we dive deep enough into logic. Which means that if AI did come around and was something which we deemed as intelligence, then by default, would this intelligence not naturally be more human than we ourselves think it would be? And it by default would develop these things. And to say that there wouldn't be differing factions of artificial intelligences vying against other AIs, and ironically, there's a lot of things that are intelligent, but we ourselves don't necessarily see them as intelligent because they don't necessarily act in the same manner that we do ourselves. So by the time in which AI is actually deemed intelligent, I think it will be much more human than robot. At what point in time is a being aware of its own being? What does something have to go through to be aware of its own existence and experience? What does something have to experience experience? Studies which are done in regards to living and non-living things, where they apply specific stimulus, look at the reaction, and then they themselves categorize this as something which is a living or non-living structure. At what point in time does something become a non-living structure? Because internally, are we not all merely just a caused reaction of environmental stimulus, even on the most inner depths of our being itself? At what point in time are we ourselves separate from God, but knowing that we were never separated from all that is, which is God itself, an ancient philosophical ideal? we can then gauge the minds of those that looked at every external event as merely something which told them about what was going on in the world at that time. Suddenly, nonsense seems to make sense in regards to how the ancients perceived the world, and every reactionary event obviously held its cause. And so we could perceive the cause by being so in tune with external stimulus that we could perceive nature and perhaps God. And if we logically analyze the actual civilizations themselves and look at the structure and form of their society, we can see that it embodied some form of spirit. And literally, this spirit was manifest by the cooperative actions of a large group of people, then forming a superorganism, which gave it height, which gave it depth. It could walk, it could move, it could see, it could perceive. It reacted like a slime mold, which in itself was composed of lower dimensions, being the people themselves that worship this thing, giving it life, right? So when we look at these ancient texts and see that there were rulers and leaders which ruled for a time being upwards of 23,000 years in some cases, were they actually describing a period of peoples which were ruled by an idea, a manifestation of an idea being their god, their ruler, their king? No more different than we could say that certain ideas live on through the worship of these ideas by the actions of their people, defining the people, their culture, their civilization. So maybe there's more to these stories about these kings ruling a people for upwards of what we today would seem to be obviously made up. Maybe there's some truth hidden within these texts. Or maybe I give them too much credit, because we don't have to look too far back to see the Brothers Grimm appear. And what was it that they taught us? So it's time for the post-workout portion of the preaching session, where I discuss in depth what it was I discussed before the post-workout preaching portion of the preaching session. We left off talking about the Brothers Grimm. And what was it that the Brothers Grimm taught us? They taught us that there's many a truth within a lie. If we dive deep enough within a lie, we're going to find truth to behold within it. I mean, these old stories have motifs, ideals, symbolism hidden within them, just as the ancient Greeks told of beasts off in the wilderness that were terrorizing villages that heroes came along and conquered. You know, this was back in a time when it wasn't that uncommon for there to be hermits out living on the land, and they probably terrorized and raided villages and whatever. They obviously fantasized the stories a little bit, where even oracles themselves have a position in this scheme as to them being able to see what others could not. Being far removed from being involved, they could perceive the picture by not being within it, you know? But we talk about how even today we classify certain time periods as eras, as epics. Maybe that's what these reigning kings of old were to the people that wrote about them. They were epics and eras of time in which the manifestations of the peoples were described by the ideals held up by this certain personage. Or I don't know, I guess it could all just be a bunch of bullshit.